I was pretty critical of part 1 in my last video, and a lot of that criticism was about how much important and interesting content they must have been leaving for part 2. I haven't read the comic this adaptation is based on, but I can say for sure that part 2 is much better than part 1. The action was more purposeful and not shoved into every other scene. Batman's consistency with his fighting ability and skills were better handled. The plot progressed at a much better pace since it wasn't held back like part 1, and nothing lasted for too long. Even though part 2 being better doesn't improve my thoughts on part 1, this half by itself has some interesting elements that I'm here to talk about. Today I'm going to be dissecting this investigation and see how it manages to explore Batman's character with Batman the Long Halloween Part 2. If you want to see my thoughts on part 1 and what I thought it could have improved on, I'll leave a link to that video in the card above, and also in the description. And while you're at it, subscribe. It's free and you can unsubscribe later on if you want. This part by itself is a lot more enjoyable than the first part, and somehow even improved story elements that originally bothered me. Both of these movies were made side by side or at least very close together, and yet they both have very different feels to them. The pacing of part 1 was very slow, and serves solely as setup while part 2 is able to capitalize on all of it. Setup can be made interesting by itself, but in a lot of cases, it serves a necessary beginning point for the plot. Some of the issues I brought up in my previous video are strangely absent from this movie. That's not a bad thing at all, but it's confusing because why did one get some elements done better than previously? For example, Batman's fighting ability wasn't very consistent in part 1. He has locked up a lot of people in Arkham at this point, and even though he's newer to being a superhero, he should still be reasonably competent. But throughout the first movie, he isn't a very good detective. Holiday is not only able to keep getting away from him, but is also able to outrun Batman while being chased despite being a normal person, instead of putting off obvious suspects. Part 2 immediately establishes that Harvey is most likely Holiday. Batman doesn't lose fights because he's incompetent, but he was either caught off guard or was overwhelmed. I think in isolation the story isn't too bad, but I would compare this two-part to the likes of a Batman special, instead of a duology of movies. The detective aspects are pretty surface level, and near the end the story kind of just ends. Harvey's defeated, and then the movie just cuts after seeing Bruce in his mansion. I don't have the context of the comics to know if this is a good adaptation of the material, but I can say that part 2 at least has some good pacing. The plot's progressing. There's never a dull moment. Everything just felt tight, but the only reason the plot could be this tightly written is because the whole first part was almost sacrificed for it. When writing a story, it's important to have your setup be interesting, not just serve a purpose. Instead of your characters sitting around waiting for a climax to appear, they should be actively engaged. Their characters should be tested, or maybe some powerful struggles should appear. This movie overall is simple. It's the ending, fights, and resolutions of the story. I think if you go into this not expecting too much, it won't be a bad watch by any means. But from how much I hear people really like the comic, I couldn't help but feel just a bit underwhelmed. Another strange aspect of this story is it kind of takes a 180 from part 1. Selina is distant like how the previous movie ended, but without much resolution they end up together, which leaves their conflict resolved without a clear reason. Batman is a lot more effective with his detective work, and tries a lot harder to find Holiday. In part 1 all he did was wait around to try and catch him in the act, but now he's snooping around, gathering evidence. Stuff I expected from him last movie. Sure, he's inexperienced, but if that was the reason for the last movie, I'm not sure why he suddenly became so much better at it. I mentioned it earlier, but the fights were a lot more effective here as Batman wasn't brawling in a back alley with some goons for 5 to 10 minutes. Let me stop bashing on part 1 for a bit here. One of the better parts of this movie was definitely Dent and Batman as characters. Dent has an interesting moral code that he adopts. As the story goes on, that's really compelling. He even turns himself in after doing what he wanted, because he believes he needs to be judged too. Though I'm not sure how he convinced all the villains including Joker and Grundy to listen to him, when in the last movie they were both free agents. Batman though, in terms of his character, is not a standard affair. Most modern Batman stories focus heavily on his no-kill rule, and essentially make that his entire character. But this is the first story in a long time that actually puts more nuance into the dynamic. He tries to save as many lives as he can, and works extremely close to the police, more than I'm used to seeing, but he isn't as strict on his no-kill rule. When Batman finally figures out who Holiday is, he gets the choice of turning them in, but after hearing their story, he asks them if the character Holiday is finished. After hearing Holiday is no more, he leaves them be. They were mourning. He understood that, and could see they weren't going to terrorize anyone else. The most exciting part of this story is in the small ways it creates a unique personality for Batman. He cares about Selina, and actively tries to care for them. He isn't super strict on his no-kill rule, and with how he deals with criminals. Though I didn't love either part, I was glad I saw them. Part 2 showed a very strong version of Two-Face's personality, though it could have had a bit more effective setup. I know a lot of people say the original comic is one of their favorites. So what'd you think? Are these movies good adaptations? Where do you think it succeeded and failed? Let me know in the comments below. And again, if you haven't yet, subscribe. It costs nothing. You can always unsubscribe later on if you want. And I hope to see you next time.